Now I want to bring in TMZ founder Harvey Levin, okay? TMZ, remember, received the first ransom note from Guthrie's alleged kidnappers. We don't know if that's what it was, but Harvey has been very out front with what's been going on. And now I'm to understand that you believe or have reason to believe that...
February 10th, a Bitcoin wallet flickered to life. For 9 days, investigators, journalists, and a grieving family had been waiting, watching, hoping. And then, suddenly, movement. A small transaction. And attached to it, a message. 4 words that stopped everyone cold. "We are ready to talk." The world read those words and assumed one thing. Ransom. Negotiation. Money. The story the public had been fed since the ransom notes first surfaced. Millions in Bitcoin, hard deadlines. The life of a 71-year-old woman dangling like a bargaining chip seemed to finally be moving again. But investigative journalist Brian Entin didn't read it that way. He never did, because Brian Entin wasn't watching this case from the outside like everyone else. He had been inside it, talking to sources close to the investigation, sitting down with retired FBI Special Agent Steve Moore, 25 years with the Bureau, someone who has worked cases most people will never hear about. And what those conversations revealed wasn't what was being reported. It was something far more calculated. Far more deliberate. That Bitcoin message on February 10th was not sent by the people who took Nancy Guthrie. It was sent in response to them. The FBI had placed that message. Law enforcement had entered that wallet. And the 4 words, "We are ready to talk," were not a cry from someone holding a 71-year-old woman against her will. They were a signal. A carefully constructed signal from investigators who had been quietly, methodically, building something the public couldn't see yet. The question is, what did the answer tell them? Hi viewers. Quick question before we go further. Did you first hear about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance through Savannah Guthrie on the Today Show, or did you find out through social media? Drop it in the comments, one or the other. Because here is where this case starts to unravel in ways that nobody has fully connected yet.
There is activity in that Bitcoin account. Again, we have the first letter with the link to the account, and I can tell you about an hour 30 minutes ago, for the first time, there was activity.
Nancy Guthrie is 71 years old. She lives alone in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona, a quiet, elevated stretch of the city where the desert meets the mountains and the streets feel insulated from the world below. She has a pacemaker. She is the mother of Savannah Guthrie, one of the most recognized faces in American morning television, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show. On the night of January 31st, Nancy was dropped off at her home at 9:50 p.m. That detail is confirmed, documented, a specific time attached to a specific moment, the last verifiable second that anyone saw Nancy Guthrie safe. By noon the next day, February 1st, her family had called 911. In between those 2 points, from 9:50 p.m. to noon the following day, something happened.
So Chris, I cannot tell you that. Not because I don't know, but there are reasons that I am not going to say. That will become clearer, I think, as the days pass.
And within that gap, investigators found a window so precise it became the spine of the entire investigation. 41 minutes, 1:47 a.m. to 2:28 a.m. At 1:47 a.m., the doorbell camera at Nancy's home went dark. Disconnected. At 2:12 a.m., a motion sensor fired inside the house. No footage, just a signal that something moved. At 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker stopped syncing. 41 minutes, and then silence. Silence is not neutral. That is something investigators understand in ways most people don't. When a signal disappears, a camera, a pacemaker, a phone, it doesn't just mean nothing is happening. It means something specific happened to make it stop. Every gap in the record is a choice someone made. Every disconnected device is a deliberate act. And on the front porch of Nancy Guthrie's home, the silence had a physical shape. There was blood, confirmed by DNA testing to be Nancy's. Right there, at the threshold of her own home, the place she had lived, the place she knew, the place someone clearly knew as well. This was not random. Nothing about those 41 minutes suggests randomness. The suspect caught on camera, masked, moving with purpose, was described as a male, approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall. He carried an Ozark Trail 25L backpack.
Since the release of these chilling images from the night of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, authorities say tips have been pouring in.
How often is video a breakthrough for investigators?
There is video everywhere. Video surveillance has become a critical element for law enforcement in helping...
Investigators know that backpack well. It is a Walmart exclusive, which means law enforcement subpoenaed Walmart records, because every exclusive product carries a supply chain, and every supply chain leaves a trail. The suspect had a visible gun holster. He moved with deliberate, controlled purpose. Not panic, not improvisation. Whoever this was, they had rehearsed this. Then came the ransom notes. 3 of them, sent not privately to the family, but to TMZ and 2 Tucson television stations. The notes demanded millions of dollars in Bitcoin. 2 separate deadlines, February 5th, February 9th. Both deadlines passed. Nothing happened. No escalation, no follow-through, no proof of life, no second contact demanding to know why payment hadn't been made. Just silence again. The kind of silence that should not exist in a legitimate kidnapping for ransom. The kind of silence that told Steve Moore and every serious investigator watching this case that something about the ransom framework was fundamentally wrong. Real kidnappers escalate. They apply pressure. They send proof of life because proof of life is leverage. They do not go quiet after a deadline passes and then surface 9 days later through a Bitcoin wallet message that sounds more like an invitation to negotiate than a threat. Savannah Guthrie, watching all of this unfold from the most public position imaginable, released a statement that stopped the country cold. She said she feared her mother had been targeted because of her. Because of the fame. Because of what her name meant and what her face represented on television every morning. I fear I brought this to her doorstep. Those words carry a weight that no one who heard them has fully set down. The FBI didn't respond emotionally. They responded operationally. The Bitcoin message on February 10th was their move. Controlled, deliberate, strategic. Former FBI Assistant Director John Miller had already framed the nature of this targeting publicly. Nancy Guthrie was chosen, he explained, because she was relatively defenseless and because she was connected to someone with resources. That combination, in the minds of people who study criminal behavior, creates what investigators call a high-value, low-resistance target. But here is what that framing quietly implies, and what Brian Entin's sources have been pointing toward for weeks. If the ransom was never real, then the ransom was never the point. Which means the question that has been sitting underneath every press conference, every tip line call, every leaked detail for 87 days is not when will the money be paid. The question is, what did they actually want? And what did the FBI's signal on February 10th reveal about how close they are to answering it? The Bitcoin wallet went quiet again after that message. No response, no contact, no next move from whoever is on the other side. But the FBI has a response of their own, and it's not being broadcast through a cryptocurrency wallet. It's being built in a laboratory in San Francisco, with a technique so advanced it was used to identify one of the most elusive serial killers in modern American history. That answer is coming, and it starts with a glove found 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's front porch. Silence has a language. Most people don't know how to read it, but the FBI does. Retired Special Agent Steve Moore, 25 years inside the Bureau, someone who has studied the behavioral patterns of people who take other people, reads silence the way a doctor reads a scan. Not for what is there, for what is missing. And in the Nancy Guthrie case, what is missing has been screaming at investigators since the very first deadline passed without a single word. February 5th came. Nothing. February 9th came. Nothing. In a genuine kidnapping for ransom, that doesn't happen. That is not how it works. That is not how it has ever worked in the documented history of ransom-based abductions. Real kidnappers are not patient. They are not quiet. They are operating under pressure, financial pressure, logistical pressure, the constant weight of maintaining control over another human being while simultaneously managing their own exposure. That pressure demands communication. It demands escalation. It demands proof of life, because proof of life is the only leverage that keeps the money moving toward them. None of that happened here. Not a single piece of it. Steve Moore was direct when Brian Entin pressed him on this. The ransom notes going to the media, to TMZ, to 2 Tucson television stations, rather than privately to the family is, in Moore's assessment, statistically abnormal. Deeply so. When ransom demands go public, one of two things is true.
Images the FBI recovered from Nancy Guthrie's Google Nest doorbell camera, providing critical clues.
Using the rim of the arch, along with the tiles, experts will be able to get his height, weight, and shoe size almost exactly.
Either the person who sent them didn't understand how ransoms actually work, or they understood perfectly, and deliberately chose the approach least likely to result in a quiet, private transaction. Think about what that second option means. If someone deliberately made this public, then the public attention was part of the design. The chaos, the headlines, the 40,000 tips flooding the phone lines, the reward climbing to $1.1 million. Maybe none of that was an accident. Maybe all of it was exactly what someone needed the world to be focused on while something else entirely was happening somewhere else. Moore's words on this are careful, precise. He does not overreach, but the implication sits right there on the surface for anyone willing to look at it directly. They were negotiating in bad faith from day one. And then there is Savannah. Savannah Guthrie is not a peripheral figure in this story. She is the emotional center of it. Every morning she has continued appearing on the Today Show, composed, professional, doing the work, while privately carrying something that most people could not hold upright. Her public statement about believing 2 of the ransom notes were legitimate. Her admission that she fears her mother was chosen specifically because of her name, her face, her presence on national television every single morning. That statement did not come from a place of speculation. It came from a daughter who has been inside this investigation in ways the public hasn't seen. Who has been talking to the people asking the hardest questions. Who looked at the evidence and arrived at a conclusion that haunts her. I fear I brought this to her doorstep. 5 words. And every one of them lands like something final. John Miller, former FBI assistant director, one of the most credible law enforcement voices in the country, put a framework around that fear when he addressed the targeting of Nancy Guthrie. He said she was chosen because she was relatively defenseless, and because she was connected to someone with significant public resources. That combination is not coincidental. That combination is a calculation. Someone studied it, weighed it, and decided the math worked in their favor. But here is where the behavioral profile starts to break down in a way that matters. Real kidnappers who target high-profile family members for money do not go 9 days without contact after their deadlines expire and then surface with a single, eerily calm message through a Bitcoin wallet. We are ready to talk. Contact us. That is not the language of desperation. That is not the language of someone applying pressure. That is the language of someone who believes they still hold leverage, or someone who received a signal and is deciding whether to respond to it. Steve Moore is clear on what the FBI's Bitcoin message represented. It was not a payment attempt. It was not capitulation. It was a controlled move designed to establish the terms of any future communication on law enforcement's timeline, not the perpetrators. You don't set the terms. The Bureau does. That is the message inside the message. And the fact that the wallet went quiet again afterward, no response, no escalation, nothing, tells investigators something they're not yet saying out loud. The silence after February 10th is not the same as the silence before it. The first silence was strategic, behavioral. It revealed who these people were and how they operated. The second silence, after the FBI made contact, suggests something different. It suggests awareness. It suggests that whoever is on the other side of this case understood exactly what that Bitcoin message meant, and chose not to answer. You do not go silent when you still have leverage. You go silent when you realize the leverage has shifted. 87 days. No proof of life. No private contact with the family. A reward sitting at $1.1 million that nobody has claimed. 40,000 tips that have kept investigators working around the clock. And a case that has quietly moved from a public ransom negotiation into something the FBI handles very differently. Something that involves laboratories and genetic science and the kind of investigative patience that doesn't make headlines until it does. The ransom, Steve Moore believes, was never the point. Which means the point was something else entirely. Something that begins 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. On the ground, waiting, a single glove, and the DNA attached to it that has no match in any criminal database in the country. That glove is where this investigation truly lives. And what the FBI is doing with the evidence collected from it, and from inside Nancy's home, is the most significant development in this case that almost nobody is talking about yet.
By continuing to canvass the area, we know a potentially black glove was recovered by authorities. Let's bring into the conversation right now TMZ executive producer Michael Babcock. Michael, thank you so much for joining us. Let's talk first about that email TMZ received about potentially trying to have Bitcoin sent.
A glove doesn't just fall. That is the first thing to understand. When physical evidence appears 2 miles from a scene, it is not random. Distance like that tells a story. It tells investigators about movement, about a route, a direction, a moment of decision. Someone moved through space after leaving Nancy Guthrie's home, and somewhere along that path, a glove came off. Was left, and on that glove, forensic teams found something that has quietly become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in this entire investigation. Male DNA. Unknown. No match in CODIS. CODIS is the National DNA Database, the system that cross-references genetic profiles against millions of convicted offenders and known persons. When there is no match, it does not mean a dead end. It means the person who left that DNA has never been entered into the system. Which means, in the language of criminal investigation, they are forensically unknown. For now, inside Nancy's home, investigators recovered something additional. Mixed DNA, multiple contributors, also no match in CODIS. 2 separate collections of genetic material. One from outside the home, on a glove found 2 miles away, and one from inside, and neither one connected to any known offender in any database. That should feel like a wall. It isn't, because of what happened next with the hair samples. Hair evidence was collected from the scene. It began its journey at the Pima County level, which, as this story will reveal, is a journey that should not have taken as long as it did. From there it moved to a forensic laboratory in Florida. And from Florida, it was transferred to the FBI. And from the FBI, it landed somewhere that changed the entire weight of this case. San Francisco. The lab in San Francisco is not a general-purpose forensic facility. It does not process routine evidence for routine cases. This is the laboratory, the specific team, the specific methodology, that was used to identify Rex Heuermann. If that name does not immediately register, it should. Rex Heuermann is the Long Island architect who was identified as the Gilgo Beach serial killer. A case that had sat cold for more than a decade. Victims discovered in 2010. No arrests for 13 years. And then, in 2023, forensic genetic genealogy cracked it open. That is the tool now pointed at the Nancy Guthrie case. Forensic genetic genealogy is not fingerprinting. It is not a simple DNA match against a database. It is something far more expansive and far more powerful. It takes a partial DNA profile, the kind of incomplete genetic material that doesn't produce a direct hit in CODIS, and builds outward from it. Researchers construct a family tree. They identify relatives of the unknown contributor, cousins, second cousins, distant connections who have uploaded their own genetic data to genealogy platforms, sometimes without any awareness of how that information might one day be used. And through those connections, they work backward and inward, mapping the genetic landscape until they can identify a specific individual who fits the profile. It is painstaking. It takes time. But it works. It worked on Rex Heuermann. It has worked on cases across the country that traditional methods could not touch. And it is working right now on evidence collected from the Nancy Guthrie investigation. This is not a routine step. That is the part that matters most and gets said the least. Forensic genetic genealogy is not something law enforcement deploys on every unsolved case. It is resource-intensive, specialized, and reserved for situations where investigators have exhausted conventional matching methods and still believe they are close to an answer. It is the tool you reach for when you have something real, something that points in a specific direction, and you need science to confirm what your sources and your instincts are already telling you. The fact that this lab is involved tells a story of its own. Brian Entin's sources have been circling a question for weeks that now feels less like speculation and more like inevitability. Does the FBI already know the identity of the person, or persons, who took Nancy Guthrie? Not beyond a reasonable doubt, not in the courtroom sense, but in the investigative sense. The sense that says, we know where we are looking, and we need the science to get us the rest of the way there. Look at what was caught on camera. The suspect is male, approximately 5 feet 9 to 5 feet 10 inches tall. He is wearing a mask. He is carrying an Ozark Trail 25L backpack, a specific product, sold exclusively through Walmart. He has a visible gun holster. And he moves through the space around Nancy Guthrie's home with a deliberateness that investigators and behavioral experts have noted repeatedly. Not panic, not hesitation, purpose. That backpack alone triggered a subpoena. Walmart records for that specific product. Because exclusive retail items carry purchase histories, and purchase histories carry names, and names lead to people. That subpoena is part of an evidence web that now includes DNA from a glove, mixed DNA from inside the home, hair samples processed through 3 separate facilities, and the full weight of the San Francisco Lab's forensic genealogy team. This is not an investigation that has stalled. This is an investigation that has gone underground. And underground investigations, in the FBI's experience, surface at moments that nobody anticipates until they are already happening. There is one more layer to this evidence picture that has not received enough attention. Jim Clemente, an FBI profiler with a career built on reading crime scenes the way others read text, has looked at the blood evidence on Nancy Guthrie's front porch and drawn a specific conclusion. One attacker. The positioning of the blood, the nature of the scene at the threshold, the physical logic of what the evidence shows. Clemente reads it as a single individual managing the situation alone. Steve Moore is not so certain. Moore's counter is statistical and operational. Sustaining control over an adult captive over an extended period is enormously difficult for a single person. The famous cases of solo abductions almost universally involve children, not adults with the physical and cognitive capacity to resist, to wait for opportunity, to outlast their captor's attention. 2 people, Moore argues, is statistically more probable. But he is careful. He will not put his weight down on either side. 2 people means coordination, shared motive, and a much higher probability that someone eventually talks. 1 person means intimate knowledge, routine, access. Someone who did not need a partner because they already knew everything they needed to know before they ever arrived. Either way, the DNA knows. And the lab in San Francisco is reading every letter of it. 220 emails. That number sits at the center of a story within a story, a thread running underneath the Nancy Guthrie investigation that, when pulled, unravels something about the very institution responsible for solving it. 220 emails between the Pima County Sheriff's Office and a production company connected to the A&E network. Emails that were being exchanged before Nancy Guthrie disappeared. Emails about a reality television program that was being planned, coordinated, and actively developed while the leadership structure of the homicide and cold case units was being quietly, systematically dismantled. Let that sit for a moment. The most high-profile disappearance in the history of Arizona, a case that would demand the deepest institutional experience a law enforcement agency could bring to bear, arrived on the doorstep of a department that had just rotated out its most experienced investigators for reasons that had nothing to do with performance. The leadership of the Pima County Sheriff's homicide and cold case units was replaced. Experienced personnel, out, and the investigator assigned to lead the Nancy Guthrie case had no prior homicide experience. Steve Moore's reaction to that fact, when Brian Entin pressed him on it, was measured. But the meaning underneath the measure was clear. Experience in homicide investigation is not interchangeable with general law enforcement experience. The skill set required to manage a scene, preserve a chain of evidence, coordinate with federal agencies, and make real-time decisions that will not compromise a future prosecution. That skill set is built over years of specific, specialized work. It is not something you arrive at on your first major case. And this was not a minor case. This was the disappearance of the mother of a nationally known television anchor. A case with federal involvement from day one. A case with a reward that climbed to $1.1 million. A case generating 40,000 tips and intense media scrutiny. The stakes of every procedural decision were enormous. The crime scene was released before investigators had finished with it. That detail cannot be overstated. A crime scene is a document. It holds information in a specific, fragile arrangement that only exists once, before weather, before movement, before the ordinary passage of time begins to dissolve the evidence it contains. When a scene is released prematurely, that document is altered. Potentially permanently. The chain of custody for anything collected afterward becomes a question. The forensic integrity of the investigation becomes something a defense attorney will examine with great care. Whether this happened through inexperience, through pressure, or through something else entirely, investigators watching the case from outside Pima County took notice. The hair samples are where the friction between agencies became impossible to ignore. Evidence of that significance, hair collected from a scene connected to a federal investigation involving kidnapping, should move to the FBI with speed. That is not an opinion. That is the standard operating procedure that experienced investigators treat as non-negotiable. The delay in transferring those samples from Pima County through a Florida lab and eventually to the FBI drew a direct response from Steve Moore. If his homicide investigators had delayed sending evidence to the FBI lab, he said, there would have been a conference. Immediately, the kind of conference where the delay is explained and does not happen again. The word Moore used for the relationship between the Pima County Sheriff's Office and the FBI in this investigation is one that should concern anyone following this case. Animosity. Animosity between the local agency holding jurisdiction and the federal bureau with the resources and authority to solve it. In an investigation where coordination is not optional, where the evidence chain runs through multiple labs in multiple states, animosity is not a personality conflict. It is a structural threat to the outcome. The Pima County Board of Supervisors took notice. A unanimous vote to formally question Sheriff Chris Nanos about the handling of the investigation. A recall effort gaining traction. Public officials asking, on the record, whether the leadership of this department is capable of doing what this case requires. Sheriff Nanos has pushed back. He has maintained his position publicly and defended his department's conduct. But the questions are not going away. And neither is the detail that sits at the center of this chapter, the one that Brian Entin's sources have been pointing toward, the one that reframes every piece of institutional friction in this case. Sheriff Nanos, early in the investigation, told people close to the case that he believes he knows the motive. He has not said it publicly. He has not shared it with the media. He has not released it in any official capacity. The motive, the reason someone chose Nancy Guthrie, the reason the ransom went to the press instead of the family, the reason the deadlines passed without escalation. The motive, according to the sheriff of Pima County, is something he has been carrying privately since nearly the beginning. Think about what that means. Not a theory, not a working hypothesis that investigators share openly as they build their case. A belief, a specific belief about why this happened, held by the top law enforcement official in the county with jurisdiction over this investigation, kept entirely out of the public record. Why would a sheriff hold back the motive in a case this public? Why, with 40,000 tips and a $1.1 million reward and a family publicly pleading for information, would the person with the most institutional authority over the investigation choose not to share the one piece of context that might unlock the public's ability to help? There are two possible answers. And neither one is comfortable. Either the motive, if revealed, would compromise the investigation in ways that could protect a suspect or alert someone who does not yet know they are being watched. Or the motive points somewhere that someone does not want it to point. Both possibilities are on the table. Both have been acknowledged by sources close to this case. And the FBI, which does not operate on the basis of local political considerations, has been watching both possibilities with equal attention. This is the shape of the investigation from the inside. A federal agency with full resources and a forensic laboratory capable of identifying suspects through genetic genealogy. A local sheriff's office with jurisdictional authority, leadership gaps, and a motive the top official won't share. 220 emails about a reality television show. An evidence chain that moved slower than it should have. And a case that has now passed 87 days without a public arrest. Either this is institutional failure on a scale that is almost difficult to comprehend. Or something about this case made someone want to slow it down. The FBI, according to Brian Entin's sources, has noticed both possibilities. And they are not waiting for the local process to catch up. That number carries a different weight depending on which side of this investigation you are standing on. For the public, for the 40,000 people who called in tips, for the journalists who have covered every press conference, for the family that has been living inside this nightmare since February 1st, 87 days feels like an absence. A silence that keeps extending. A case that keeps not being solved. But for the FBI, 87 days is not silence. It is assembly. The question that has divided the sharpest investigative minds on this case for every one of those 87 days is deceptively simple. One person, or two? A single individual who moved through Nancy Guthrie's home and disappeared back into the desert landscape of Tucson. Or two people who coordinated, who planned together, who shared the weight of what they were doing across two sets of hands. Jim Clemente, FBI profiler, a career built on reading the language of crime scenes, has looked at the blood evidence on Nancy's front porch and concluded, one attacker. The physical logic of the scene, the positioning, the nature of what the evidence shows at the threshold of that home, Clemente reads it as a single person managing the exit alone. No second set of hands. No shared coordination at the moment of departure. Steve Moore sees it differently, not because he dismisses Clemente's reading, but because the statistical and operational weight of the question pulls him in a different direction. Maintaining control over an adult over any extended period of time is a challenge that compounds with every hour that passes. The historical record of single-actor abductions involving adults, not children, adults, is thin. The cases that hold together over time almost always involve more than one person. The logistics demand it, the pressure demands it, but Moore is disciplined. He will not commit. His words. You cannot put your weight down on the ice. That metaphor matters. It is not caution for its own sake. It is a specific kind of investigative humility that experienced agents develop. The understanding that premature certainty in the wrong direction can redirect resources, narrow focus, and allow someone to exist just outside the edge of where you are looking. The FBI does not publicly commit to one attacker or two. They work both possibilities simultaneously, because the cost of being wrong about something that fundamental is too high. But here is what each answer implies, and why the distinction carries so much weight. Two people means coordination. It means shared motive, shared knowledge, shared risk. And it means exposure, the statistical reality that when two people carry a secret of this magnitude for this long, under this level of investigative pressure, with a reward of $1.1 million sitting in the open, someone's willingness to stay silent eventually reaches a limit. People talk. They talk to someone they trust. And someone they trust talks to someone else. The case that breaks on a tip, on a conversation that found its way to the wrong ears. That is a very real possibility when two people are involved. One person means something colder. One person means intimate knowledge. It means someone who did not need a partner because they already knew the layout of the home, the timing of the routines, the precise details of a life lived alone in the Catalina foothills. Someone who had studied the situation so thoroughly that a second set of hands was never part of the calculation. That level of knowledge does not come from research alone. It comes from proximity, and proximity leaves traces. That is what the physical evidence is now doing, tracing the edges of proximity. The glove 2 miles from the home. The male DNA with no Cody's match. The mixed DNA from inside the house. The hair samples now in the hands of the San Francisco lab, being processed through forensic genetic genealogy by the same team that reached back through a decade of cold silence and found Rex Heuermann. This is not a case that is waiting. The San Francisco lab does not wait. It builds. It maps genetic connections outward from a partial profile, identifies family trees, narrows toward a specific individual, and produces results that hold up in a federal courtroom. The fact that this tool is deployed on this evidence is the most significant signal the investigation has sent in 87 days. And it has sent it almost entirely without public acknowledgement. Meanwhile, Derek Colella has a trial date. June 23rd Road, Federal Courthouse, Tucson. Colella is the individual arrested for sending fraudulent texts connected to the case, messages that asked whether Bitcoin had been received, inserting himself into the communications surrounding a federal investigation. His case moves forward on its own timeline, separate from but touching the larger investigation in ways that federal prosecutors understand precisely. Federal courthouses do not schedule trials on cases they cannot prove. That detail is not incidental. Here is what the full picture looks like from the outside, assembled from everything Brian Entin's sources have pointed toward across 87 days of investigation. A woman was taken from her home in a 41-minute window in the middle of the night. The perpetrator or perpetrators moved with deliberate preparation. They disconnected a camera. They left physical evidence behind, a glove, DNA, hair, that has now traveled through 3 forensic facilities and landed with one of the most powerful genetic identification teams in the country. They sent ransom notes to the media instead of the family. They let 2 deadlines pass without escalation. They surfaced briefly on February 10th and then went silent again after a law enforcement signal entered the Bitcoin wallet. Someone out there has been watching all of this. Every press conference, every Brian Entin episode, every headline, Every tip line update, every public statement from the Guthrie family. Someone has sat with the full knowledge of what happened between 1:47 and 2:28 a.m. on the night of January 31st, and has chosen, every single day for 87 days, to stay quiet. The FBI is building the case that makes that silence impossible to keep. Forensic genetic genealogy does not need a confession. It does not need a tip. It does not need someone to crack under the weight of a $1.1 million reward. It needs what the San Francisco lab already has, a genetic thread. And from that thread, it builds a name. The Bitcoin message on February 10th said, "We are ready to talk." The answer has been assembling in a laboratory ever since. And when it arrives, it will not be announced through a cryptocurrency wallet or a press conference or a carefully worded statement from the Pima County Sheriff's Office. It will arrive the way these things always arrive in federal investigations. Quietly, precisely, and with enough documentation to close every door. The answer is coming. And the one detail that Brian Entin's sources have pointed to, the specific piece of information that the sheriff of Pima County has held privately since nearly the beginning, the motive that has never been made public. That detail is the key that unlocks everything else in this case. In the next video, that motive gets examined. What it likely means, why it was kept back, and what it reveals about the targeting of Nancy Guthrie that changes the way this entire case has to be understood. Do not miss it.